Lucius Tillius Cimber, Praetor 45 BCE. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, 60 conspirators gathered around the Roman dictator, Gaius Julius Caesar, and they perforated him with their daggers until he expired. They called themselves the Liberators, and they claimed to be acting in order to save the Republic from the tyranny of one-man rule. We don't know the names of the vast majority of this group. Lucius Tillius Cimber, however, had his name preserved for two reasons. First, he was one of a relatively small group of Caesarians who joined the conspiracy. More importantly, he played a central role in the plot, as it was his role to distract Caesar and then attempt to pin him down while his comrades got in close to do dagger work. In this video, we will look at Cimber's career, focusing on how he came to be a conspirator, his actions on the morning of March 15th, and his subsequent fate. Ultimately, we will see that his fame owes primarily to putting himself forward at a moment pregnant with drama and drawing the interest of no less a writer than William Shakespeare. Lucius Tillius Cimber hailed from a minor plebeian gens Tillia. This gens didn't produce very many famous people, with very few men named Tillius achieving office high enough to earn the attention of historical narrative writers, but quite a few men from the family did make the Senate, and there are a number of inscriptions which attest to minor senators bearing the name Tillius. In terms of where the family came from originally, most likely they were Umbrian or Sabine in origin, which actually means that it's possible they joined the Senate in the early Republic, since the Sabines were very closely related to the Romans, and the Romans began to expand into their territory and integrate them fairly early on. Most likely, though, the family joined up in the Senate sometime in the Middle Republic. Quite a few people were admitted during the Second Punic War, when the Senate was gutted, and so that is as plausible a time as any. As for the meaning of the cognomen Cimber, here's where I must admit that I do not own a copy of the TLL or the OLD, the two great Latin dictionaries of note, because most of my research is in Greek, so that's where I put my money. But according to authors I've read who talk about Cimber's background, they have two varying ideas as to the origin of his name. One idea is that he or one of his ancestors was reminiscent in some way of the Cimbri tribe, a famous Gallic tribe from northern Italy, and that perhaps some characteristic of the family reminded people of this Gallic tribe. Or perhaps maybe they fought this tribe at some point and did well. The other thought is that Cimber is a word which means something like thuggish. And so this was a way to say that this branch of the family was willing to get their hands dirty. Again, without the proper linguistic resources, I couldn't really tell you. So if one of you happens to have the TLL or the OLD, go ahead and look that up and let me know in the comments. There's another branch of the family as well, the Tillius Rufus branch. Rufus means red. And their success was about equal. Mostly we're talking about minor officials and a handful of men penetrating to the senior ranks once in a while. We know that Lucius had a brother named Publius. We do not know which one of them was the elder, but most likely we know that Publius was a fellow senator at some point who fell into disgrace, and we're not really sure why. And that's an issue we're going to revisit since it has a lot of bearing on Lucius's life, this scandal that he presumably had nothing to do with, and yet troubled him very deeply. When it comes to Lucius Tillius Cimber, we don't know a whole lot about the man. We do know that he was trusted by Caesar, and he was an insider. We also know that Caesar trusted him more than most because he had already served as praetor, and that meant that within a few years he would probably be eligible to run for consul. He was not included in Caesar's succession plan, which only went out all the way to 42, but presumably he was pretty well set up for the future. In terms of how he earned Caesar's trust in this way, most likely if we look at the careers of better attested people such as Mark Antony, Gaius Trebonius, and Publius Vatinius, the likelihood is that he served Caesar in the 50s and 40s in varying capacities. He might have shown up in Gaul once or twice to serve as a legate. He also might have advocated for Caesar in the Senate, or served him in the civil wars in some way. But certainly we know that he didn't have any single moment where he was really doing anything noteworthy, otherwise he would have been mentioned in the commentaries. He also did have a reputation for playing dirty, and I wonder if the scholar who suggested that his name meant thuggish was simply referring to his reputation and assuming that the name was relevant to his reputation. But most Roman aristocrats in their youth would do things that are questionable. I think I've mentioned before that for many Roman aristocratic youth, if they were to see A Clockwork Orange, they would see that as kind of a documentary about themselves. And apparently Cimber went a little bit further with this than most. Whether this was something in his past or something that was more recent is hard to say, but certainly he appears to be someone who had gotten in quite a number of fights, and most likely those fights occurred during the rough days of the 50s when you had literal gangs brawling in the streets. But in terms of how relevant that was to who Cimber had become as an ex-Praetor going into 44, or how many fistfights he'd been in the last decade, well, I couldn't really tell you. Also, I'm pretty sure that Caesar would just hire gladiators, for the most part, when it came to doing rough work rather than relying upon rich boys who needed to keep their faces nice and clean for their statue bust. We may not know the precise details of Cimber's service, but we do know that he had done enough and done it well enough that Caesar trusted him. Caesar had already rewarded him with the second highest regular office of Praetor in 45, and now going forward, this meant that although Cimber had not been consul yet, he was still one of the more senior men in a Senate which had been very much gutted of its senior leadership. The Civil War had been hard on many of the ex-consuls. And so, Cimber, despite not having attained the highest rank, was still one of the more senior guys in the body at this point. He also would be going out as governor in either a pro-praetorian or perhaps even pro-consular capacity, which was quite an honor, and the province he was going to was both wealthy and strategically important, Bithynia and Pontus. This area was large, so it would be somewhat difficult to govern. It also had a lot of frontier, which meant both danger and opportunity. So between the wealth of the area and the potential for warfare, Cimber would have a chance to fight a local war, gain fame, and also gain plunder, which would then enable him to come home and run for office. So Cimber was very much set up very well at this point in his life. And therefore it's a bit of a mystery as to why he, of all people, would want to see Caesar dead, since Caesar had done so much to set him up for success. It's a little bit difficult to imagine exactly what might have motivated Lucius Tillius Cimber to turn traitor. After all, he was doing quite well under Julius Caesar, but clearly not well enough to keep him loyal. Caesar obviously did not see this betrayal coming, but Cimber clearly felt in his heart that it was the right thing to do. So what might have driven Cimber to take this dramatic action? Well, to us, the rewards he was receiving seemed just, but maybe he felt that he was not being given enough credit for the things that he had done. Maybe he felt that he was just as important as Antony or Lepidus or one of the others. Or maybe he was simply angry that a number of the people who'd been defeated and pardoned, Brutus comes to mind, were now being courted very hard by Caesar, whereas he as a loyalist was taken for granted. So if his loyalty actually was to Caesar, and it's possible that it was, then this might have been enough of a grievance to drive him to take up a dagger. Ancient aristocrats are very sensitive people, and they tend to express their feelings with pointy objects. In terms of a more personal motive, he had a brother named Publius who had been banished from Rome for some unspecified offense. This doesn't seem like that big of a deal, although of course this would be a way for Caesar to show Cimber his favor, would be to pardon his brother. Now, the thing to keep in mind that would have made this especially offensive for someone like Cimber is that Caesar was extremely liberal with his pardons. Caesar had pardoned virtually everyone who had been exiled in the 50s when he first started the Civil War. The only exception was made for Milo. And so almost everyone who had ever done anything had been pardoned by Caesar at some point. He'd also pardoned all of his opponents in the Civil War at least once. A couple of them he actually tried to give a couple of chances. And so for someone as merciful as Caesar, someone who prided himself on his clemency, to not pardon Publius Cimber, this must have felt like a thumb in the eye. And in fact, this will be part of the pretext that will set up the assassination. We'll revisit that in a minute. There might be some other motives, however, and some of those motives are a little bit more noble. Of course, our sources tend to not focus on the minor conspirators, but is there any real reason to think that just because his family is a little bit more minor in the Senate, that Tillius Cimber was any less attached to the Republic than Brutus or Cassius? If they are attached to aristocratic values and they are benefiting from the system the same way that he is, why would they be ultra-patriots, whereas he's just a selfish and knavish opportunist? I don't think there's any reason to assume that about him. It's possible that he very much was motivated by the norms of the Republic, that he very much wanted his descendants to be able to have the thrill of running for office and winning fairly, and gaining the credit that that entails. So for him, perhaps it was in the best interest of men named Cimber that the future of the Republic be free, and that the offices that it bestowed be bestowed as honors by the people, rather than as gifts by a master. Another thing to remember, too, is that if his reputation for thuggery is actually founded in fact, and we don't really know that, of course, then perhaps his recent service as Praetor had kind of made him grow up. And so now he found himself more invested, more serious, and very much desirous of showing the world that he was a big boy now. And like a lot of people who had a rough youth, who did too many drugs, partied hard, engaged in thuggish activities or sexual license, maybe he had become a moralist as of late, and he was now very much a dedicated sort of reformer when it comes to morality. And maybe all of this was a dramatic way for him to turn the page of his own life. All of these things could be in play. Our sources, however, definitely think that Cimber was driven mostly by what had happened to his brother, and maybe some love for the Republic, but mostly his personal grievance over his brother being stuck in exile, whereas every other asshole had gotten to come home. The recruitment and planning phase of the conspiracy seems to have been rather abbreviated, and at some point, probably within a couple weeks of the Ides of March, Cimber was approached and recruited for the plot. The plan, as it formed, saw him play the central role. His job was to play up the ongoing petition he kept making to Caesar in order to keep Caesar distracted while the other conspirators moved into place. And so in many ways, Cimber's role would be the most difficult of them all, because he would have to act convincingly and also prostrate himself in a way that was somewhat embarrassing in order to make all of this go to plan. The idea was for him to approach Caesar and distract him while Caesar was walking into the theater of Pompey, to talk about this petition that Caesar was clearly tired of. Some of our sources imply that Caesar was being rude about Cimber's petition, saying, "I've already said no, my decision stands, your brother's not coming back, not now, not ever." But Cimber had to keep pushing the issue even though he knew it would never happen. So this was something that maybe he had already acted out multiple times for real, so now he was just going to have to fake it. So as he takes up Caesar's attention and crowds Caesar's space to distract him physically, the other conspirators were moving into place around the curule chair where Caesar would sit. Once Caesar took his seat, Cimber then sprang into action for real. So as Caesar sits down, Cimber, as was a custom among suppliants, threw himself at Caesar's feet. And this was a somewhat undignified and unmanly thing to do, but it was a custom, especially from the Greek world, where a suppliant would throw one arm around the back of someone's knees and put the other hand on their beard if they had one, as a way to show that I'm not going to let you get up until you answer my request one way or the other. Caesar, of course, didn't have a beard, but Cimber was kind of playing up to that idea when he threw himself upon Caesar and grabbed his toga. So trying to make it look perhaps like a bit of an accident that he pulled on the toga too hard and pulled it down, Cimber then exposed Caesar's neck. And once Caesar's neck was exposed, he may have then cried out to his fellow conspirators to strike, or else they simply understood that the moment had arrived and they began in earnest to try to rain down blows. It's worth mentioning that apparently Caesar was able to fight back very successfully at first against the first striker, one of the Casca brothers. So Cimber apparently did not do as good of a job as he might have. It's also worth mentioning that because of the weird fit that togas have, that grabbing someone's toga and dragging on it might not be quite as effective at fixing someone in place as they assumed. And so this plan didn't really work that well, but Cimber still had the most difficult spot, and as we all know, Caesar did die. So Cimber did well enough, even if his performance could have been improved a bit when it came to actually fixing Caesar in place and preventing him from striking back at his attackers. The immediate aftermath of the assassination actually saw a brief period of peace between the Liberators and the Caesarians. But by the summer, this was breaking down, partly because of the introduction of the wild card Octavian, Caesar's heir, who played up the sentiments of the Caesarian desire for revenge against the Liberators. The main focus of the conflict in Italy, however, was between the consul Mark Antony, who was one of Caesar's major heirs, and Decimus Brutus, who in that period was actually the most prominent and powerful of the Liberators. And so they were fighting a war in North Italy. But up to this point, peace had prevailed in most of the rest of the Roman world. It was a very tenuous peace, and it was pretty obvious to most that a war would break out. But perhaps there was still a chance that if the Liberators got just enough force out east, that the Caesarians in the west would agree to go back to a peaceful settlement. And so many of the Liberators, including Cimber, went east and assumed their provincial commands. Cimber took up the governorship of Bithynia and Pontus. His near neighbor Gaius Trebonius went to Roman Asia. Later on, Brutus and Cassius would both seize provinces of their own, but we're not here to talk about them. The first major event that Cimber had to confront as governor actually occurred in his neighboring province of Asia. Here, Trebonius was still governing, and he had given away many of his troops to his neighbors Brutus and Cassius to help them. And so he was a little bit undermanned. He was at the city of Smyrna, and Dolabella was traveling through on his way out to Syria, where he was destined to become governor. Dolabella was a Caesarian loyalist, and so there was some tension, but the idea was that technically they were still not at war, and they would cooperate and hopefully hold this very tenuous peace together. But there was an exchange of insults when Dolabella asked for supplies, and he and Trebonius did not see eye to eye on that issue. Dolabella settled the issue by storming Smyrna, where Trebonius happened to be at the time, killing him, and then claiming that he was avenging the death of Caesar. So this meant that the war had now reached the east. And as the nearby governor, who would have actually had an army, it was up to Cimber, most likely, to provide the first response. We don't have a lot of the details of this conflict, as it didn't involve a lot of actions, but most likely Cimber would have played a role in this. The person who gets named as the guy who settles the issue was Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had strong ties in Syria due to previous service dating back to the disastrous Carrhae battle, and he was able to ultimately track down and defeat Dolabella. This gave him control of both Asia and Syria. And that's why later, Cassius will actually have the largest army of the Liberators at the Battle of Philippi. Speaking of which, Cimber, ahead of Philippi and during the War of Dolabella, would start raising troops and ships for the Liberator cause. So one or more of the legions that fought at Philippi in October of 42 were probably raised in Bithynia Pontus, or at least some of the supplies that they used were from Bithynia Pontus. and some of the ships that supported them would have been built perhaps in Nicomedia or Chalcedon or one of the other cities of the province. So Cimber actually plays a relatively major role, even if it's a little bit understated, in the settlement of the East and the setup for the Philippi campaign. When it came time for the Battle of Philippi in October of 42, Cimber had done a great deal to help make this possible. The two senior commanders were Brutus and Cassius, but Cimber would not have been that far below them in the pecking order, as he was a provincial governor and a former praetor. So this meant that he most likely was the second in command to one or the other of the most famous liberators. That being said, we don't really know exactly what he did in this battle. The battle took place on 2 separate days. On the first day, Brutus was able to rout Octavian, but this was offset by the fact that Antony shattered Cassius. And Cassius was quick to assume that Brutus had also failed, and he decided to commit suicide rather than live in a world where Caesar's heirs were victorious. Brutus was able to rally Cassius' survivors just as Antony rallied Octavian and his men, and this led to a second clash a couple weeks later on October 23rd. In this second battle, Antony and Octavian won, and Brutus, who knew that it was over, decided to follow Cassius' example, and also the example of his uncle Cato the Younger, and commit suicide rather than live in a world where everything had gone against him. Cimber participated in the battle. He was probably a wing commander in one or both of the two battles. But in terms of exactly what he did, or which army he was in, or whether he fell in the first battle or the second, or whether he took his own life or was killed in action, we simply don't know, because our sources tend not to focus on the more minor players. And despite his role in the drama on the Ides of March and his fine acting skills, he still was just that, a minor player. At the Battle of Philippi, if Brutus had been mortally wounded but still victorious against Octavian, and Cassius had died as happened historically, the odds are pretty good that Lucius Tillius Cimber would have become the overall commander of the Liberator army. He had the same level of seniority as the other two men, as a praetor who was currently governing a province, and with them gone, it is unlikely that anyone in his camp would have outranked him. So that would have given him the con. As things played out, however, that's not how things worked out. He served as a subordinate in one or both of the battles of Philippi and died quietly. That means that in many ways he's kind of an example of the quintessential backbencher, someone who is a minor player in Roman politics who just happened to have a moment in the sun. He played a pivotal and dramatic role in Caesar's assassination, and that's really the only reason anybody knows his name today. Again, it is worth reminding you once more that had things worked out very slightly differently, we would have to talk about him as a commander of one of the most important battles in Roman history. But that isn't quite how things panned out. In terms of how minor he really is, despite his importance in the war effort in 42, in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Cimber plays a big role, but he is incorrectly named Metellus Cimber. That being said, Caesar does get the details right of his role in the plot, so there's that. And he also talks about his brother being in exile, which is an accurate detail. And perhaps more damning than Caesar getting things wrong after so many centuries is that sources written a century or two after Cimber's time often also bungled his name. Nicolaus of Damascus, for instance, calls him Tullius Cimber rather than Tillius Cimber. So, despite being someone who has a claim to be important, he's still being stuck in the category of minor players. And I have to say, though, because he didn't quite make it to a prominent role in the Liberator force, he's someone who is rated. So Men like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus are probably overrated, whereas Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus and Gaius Trebonius are probably underrated. And Cimber's just kind of rated. I think he gets just about the right amount of coverage for what he did and how senior he was. And so with that thought, that Cimber was treated more fairly than he treated Caesar, I bid you adieu. I'm Thersites the Historian, and tomorrow we'll talk about another conspirator who took part in the Ides of March, and then on the Ides itself, we'll talk about the conspiracy and execution of that conspiracy. Until then, beware the Ides.